Well, hello everyone and welcome to yet another Discussions with Dolf. We are still here in Phoenix, and I think you'll see behind me there are some outcrops, there are some peaks, little hills you might call them, or mini mountains or whatever. But just like a recent discussion where I had a film footage of a house stuck on a big rock, here on top of this peak here you'll see there's another home built. And I'll say it again, I know I've said it before, that many people before they've been to Phoenix, they think it's just one big flat hot brown desert, and nothing could be further from the truth. There are lots of interesting mountains and hills and rocky outcrops, and people have adapted this environment to build houses on top of them, beside them, underneath them. Of course, that house up there will have a tremendous view, spectacular 360-degree view. It will also catch any prevailing wind. In many places that is not a good thing, but there's not much wind here in general, so especially in the summertime when it gets hot, you kind of want to have every bit of breeze that you can get to keep yourself cool. Anyway, I want to continue the discussion we had last time, where Elise out of Brisbane in Australia had a question on the advantages of commercial real estate relative to residential. And I went over a number of the advantages. You may recall them. The tenants earn their income there, so they have a vested interest in keeping it looking good. They tend to pay the property taxes, insurance and maintenance, and a triple net type lease, and they tend to want to renovate the building a lot more than any tenants of mine have ever wanted to renovate my residential properties, and they'll even offer to pay for it. And to go beyond that, sometimes they'll even ask you to pay for the renovations on a commercial property, but in the lease document there is an agreement that should you agree to do that, they'll pay extra rental in the form of X% of the cost of the renovations. These things don't happen with residential properties at all. But what I want to discuss today is what I think are the two disadvantages of commercial real estate. And yes, there are some disadvantages, but I think they're all focused around two main ones. And the first one is that in general, banks tend to lend a much lower percentage of the purchase price or the registered appraisal, whichever is the lower. So in residential properties, you're familiar that it's very common to have loan to value ratios of maybe 70%, 80%. In fact, here in the United States, banks will easily lend 80% without requiring what's called a mortgage insurance, which is an insurance, by the way, such that if you can't pay the bank, the insurance company will pay the bank. It's not insurance that if the tenant can't pay you, the insurance company will pay you, although I have to add there's insurance for that too. So sometimes they go beyond that. They might do 80%, 90%, 95%. I've lived in times when banks were offering 100% of the cost of buying a property, and if you think that's ridiculous, in the late 70s in the Netherlands, banks were offering 125% of the purchase price. You might say, how on earth is that even possible? And when you think about it, it's quite logical, because often when you buy a house, it's in need of a lot of work. It needs repairs, hasn't been worked on for maybe 3 or 4 decades. So by offering you 25% more than you're required to pay for it, then you can spend money on doing it up, and the bank doesn't miss out, because the theory is that the value of the property will come up to compensate that. So whereas on residential properties, banks easily go up to 80%, sometimes 90%, sometimes 100%, and even in extenuating circumstances 125%. When it comes to commercial real estate, banks tend to be a lot more conservative, and they'll only lend about 50%, sometimes 60%, sometimes 66%. That tends to be about the limit of what most banks are willing to do. So on the surface, this seems like a disadvantage, but hold that thought. And then the other downside of commercial real estate relative to residential is that it can, in some circumstances, be more difficult to find a tenant. Now, I think you'll all agree that if you've got a house, if you've got a residential property and you've had it on the market for 3 or 4 weeks and you haven't found a tenant, it's not because the color of the carpet in the spare bedroom is the wrong shade of blue, or that the aspect of the windows in the kitchen relative to where the sun comes up in the middle of winter is wrong. It's got nothing to do with any of that. It's simply that the price is too high. And if you drop it by $100 or $200 a month, you'll generally get a tenant pretty quickly. Well, unfortunately, that doesn't work with commercial property. You might have had it for 6 months on the market and still no tenant, and even halving the rent wouldn't get a tenant, because if it's a factory that is designed to make telex machines, or to be a bit more modern, to make fax machines, and there's no demand for telex machines or fax machines, then you're not going to find a tenant. So they are the two big disadvantages of commercial property. And I see that I've rapidly run out of time, but what I'll do in our next discussion is go over my view as to how we can counter these two disadvantages, because I think you'll agree with me that if we can counter the two main disadvantages of commercial property, then we're left with all the advantages. And I think, like me, you might come to the conclusion that commercial property is pretty good. Anyway, that's all we've got time for. I look forward to seeing you again next time. And in the meantime, as always, successful investing. Thank you.